New data is suggesting that a crash not seen since the Great Depression is potentially coming in 2024. Meanwhile, gold prices have hit an all-time high. Oh, and the Dow Jones just hit an all-time high as well. And typically those two things aren't supposed to happen at the same time, which means either the gold bettors or the stock bettors are wrong. Because somebody needs to be wrong, right? Well, not necessarily, but I'll get to that a little bit later on. And on top of all that, the Fed just changed its stance on interest rates, but that has some Fed governors a little bit confused. And if all of that wasn't enough, we now have some housing experts suggesting that prices are set to fall, which means 2024 could end up being an absolutely devastating year. But isn't that what they said about 2023? Yep, if memory serves me correctly, 2023 was supposed to be awful. And I'm going to get into all the details, but before I do me a favor. If you want to thrive financially, this is the place for you. So do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. I genuinely appreciate everyone who subscribes, so thank you in advance. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss what is clearly a volatile US economy. And I want to start with this article from Fox. New data reveals a crash not seen since the Great Depression could hit in 2024. With the subheadline, if the White House and Congress don't cut spending soon, the results could be catastrophic. Now, this is an interesting article, and the reason it is so interesting is because it is discussing the money supply, and more specifically, the fact that the money supply has not decreased at the rate it's decreasing right now since the Great Depression. But there's one significant difference between then and now, and that is that during the Great Depression, when the money supply shrank, it put downward pressure on pricing. So in other words, it had a deflationary effect. However, that is not the case today. And that is largely due to the fact that the federal government is continuing to spend a significant amount of money, and they're borrowing to do so, which is potentially creating a giant economic crisis that could potentially be right around the corner. And according to this article, if the White House and Congress don't cut inflationary spending, it could be catastrophic. In fact, the M2 money supply growth has actually been negative for the last 3 quarters. And in the last 110 years, the only other time that Americans have seen the money supply drop this sharply was in the early 1930s, during the height of the Great Depression. But the big difference between the 1930s and today is that when the money supply dropped back then, so too did prices. In fact, prices are still going up even though there is a collapse in the money supply. And this is largely due, again, to government spending. Even though the Fed is not pumping money into the economy, the federal government is, and that is causing prices not to decline the way that they should. And you can see this clearly in the M2 money supply graph from the Fed. The money supply has dropped drastically since the middle of last year. Now, this article points out that this is significantly different than the 1930s because we aren't seeing prices decline. However, there is one other huge difference between now and back then, and that is the steep increase in the money supply that happened in 2020. So the big difference here could be that the money supply is dropping relative to the significant increases in 2020, and that there's a significant amount of padding in the money supply for this drop to happen, which means the headline from Fox could be a little bit sensational. And that's not surprising because when news articles or people in general look at individual economic metrics and then compare it to the past, they leave out a ton of details and a ton of potential variables that could potentially tell a different story. So the fact that there's this significant decline in the M2 money supply may not be as big of a deal as this article makes it out to be. Now, all that being said, the money supply is going down, but the Fed is also pivoting from their tightening policies. For the first time in the last couple of years, they are now suggesting that they could ease monetary policy. However, Powell emphasized that any projections about interest rate cuts are not a preset plan. And he immediately backpedaled on the information that was released during the rate announcement, suggesting that they could potentially have firming policies if the data suggested that it was warranted. So because the market perceived the fact that interest rate cuts were imminent thanks to the change in tone, he had to take a step back and say, whoa, that may not necessarily be the case. And that had other Fed governors trying to pull back the positive market reactions from the change in tone from the Fed. But the primary confusion comes from this graph, which is the Fed's dot plot. This is a graph of the Fed committee's voting members' position on where they believe interest rates will be in the coming years. Now, as you can see, all of the voting members at this moment agree that interest rates should be around the 5.25 to 5.5% range. That is this lineup right here. But as you can see from the graph, as we head into 2024, the large majority of the 19 voting members are starting to believe that some sort of interest rate cuts will be warranted in 2024. with the large majority believing that interest rates will end up somewhere between 4.25 and 5%. And as we move into 2025, the voting members believe that interest rates will get lower and lower and lower as we get into the longer run. But there's some problems with the Fed's dot plot. First, this is not a forecast. This is just a temperature reading of where the Fed governors believe they're going to have to move interest rates into the future. And there's some serious confirmation bias here. Because if you're a voting member with the Fed, you obviously are going to have the belief that you got the job done, which means that you're going to have to lower interest rates because inflation's back to where it should be. So very few people are going to suggest that higher interest rates are going to be warranted because that would be a suggestion that they aren't doing their job properly. Now, on top of that, there's some other downsides. The Fed's dot plot historically is very inaccurate. Take, for example, in December of 2021, where the majority of members believed that by the end of December 2022, interest rates would be around the 1% range. Obviously, that didn't happen, and rates ended up soaring to 4.25 to 4.5%. And the reality here is that the further out officials go, the harder it becomes to predict what's actually going to happen. And what's even worse is businesses and consumers start to base their buying decisions based on these dot plots when they are, like I said, historically inaccurate. In fact, Jerome Powell himself said in 2019, as you can see, if you're too focused on a few dots, you may miss the larger picture. So in other words, the forecast is merely a forecast and isn't designed to be precise. It may be accurate in the sense of which direction interest rates will go, but it will not be precise in predicting where they will fall. And that is one of the primary problems with forecasting, is forecasts are not precise. In the same way that weather forecasts are often accurate but not precise, in other words, suggesting about what the temperature will be but not exactly what the temperature will be, so too is the Fed dot plot and pretty much every other economic forecast. And you need look no further than the current markets to demonstrate exactly how hard it is to forecast what is going to happen in the future. Because as of this moment, for example, you have falling oil prices, record gold prices, record stock market values, and a 10-year bond yield that has jumped, indicating that there may be a soft landing and not a Great Depression. And when you have, for example, record gold prices but bond yields that are increasing, well, those two things indicate exactly the opposite outcomes. Rising gold prices indicate there's going to be a recession. Rising bond yields indicate there's going to be a soft landing and potentially a rebound in the market. And in the same way, the stock market hitting all-time highs at the same time that gold hits all-time highs is an indicator that the market in general is confused. And I'll get to what you should be doing about this in a second. Because here's the thing, if you listened to forecasters at the end of 2022, they pretty much all said that 2023 was going to be awful, and it wasn't. I mean, aside from the rising interest rates and it getting harder to buy a home and that sort of thing. And the economists put it best. When it comes to how the economy will do in 2024, the best thing to do is not ask a forecaster, or in most cases, an economist. Because the only consensus in today's market is that there is no consensus. In fact, just look at this graph from The Economist that shows Goldman Sachs, UBS, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, and their forecast for GDP growth. UBS, for example, has it dropping significantly in 2024 and then increasing in 2025, while pretty much everyone else has some degree of decrease in 2024, followed by a further decrease in 2025. And here's the problem with forecasts, is people use those forecasts in order to make buying decisions, investing decisions, and in order to try to time the market. This is the new reality of the economy, which is a day trading mentality. People trying to get ahead on a 3, 6, 12-month basis rather than making long-term decisions. And I'm going to tell you right now, when it comes to forecasts, the reality is it doesn't matter what any of the forecasts are. In fact, it doesn't even matter what happens in the economy. It doesn't matter if we have the next Great Depression. It doesn't matter if we have a boom. It really doesn't make a difference unless you're unprepared. And no matter what any economic forecast says, we should always be prepared for the worst case scenario. And we should also always be prepared for whatever the best case scenario is as well, or at least be prepared to take advantage of those opportunities. So watching the news headlines and worrying about the next Great Depression is probably not something you should be spending your time focusing on. What you should be focusing on is putting yourself in a position so that if the worst happens in the future, you don't have to worry about it. And what that means is really simple. It's all about being in complete control of your own destiny. And what that means is not owing people money, It means owning your own home and not being at the mercy of landlords. And it means building up your investments slowly and safely without taking significant amounts of risk, so that if the worst happens and a recession comes along, you lose your job, and you need some money to stay afloat, you have it available to you. Because regardless of what happens in the economy, there's only one thing you should be focusing on, and that is what is within your control. And what is in your control is the decisions that you personally make. So going out and doom spending on things that you can't afford or things that you have to borrow money to buy is your decision. So too is not buying those things and putting the money away so that you don't have to worry about not having any money if you lose your job. And no, you shouldn't be plowing all of your money into physical gold and physical silver because the dollar may collapse, because those are probably not the best assets to have if the market goes the other direction. Like I said, there's a 50-50 chance that the market's going to continue to go up. We're going to have a soft landing. And there's a 50-50 chance that the market will go down and the dollar's value is going to go down, and all of those bad things that people say are going to happen are actually going to happen. So now is not the time to be going out and putting all your chips on black, or in this case, gold, or for that matter, into the stock market or any other one investment. Now is the time to put money aside, diversify your portfolio, make sure you have as little debt as possible, and make sure you own your own home so that you are in complete control if the worst case scenario happens. Oh, and if you want to see another video on why you shouldn't buy physical gold and silver, make sure you check out this one right here.